Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority Board of Directors meeting. It is Thursday, October 19th, 2023, and we do have a quorum. Thank you, everyone. First on our agenda is to approve the agenda. Do I have a motion? Motion by Jesse, seconded by Mike. And do we have any dialogue on the agenda? Is it fine the way it's set? Seeing no hands, we'll take the vote. All those in favor, raise your hand. Beautiful, that passed unanimously. Thank you, everyone. We're on to public comment. There is no one in the gallery. And so, Deb, is there anyone online who'd like to make a comment?
Yes, we have Jim Mogensen, and you are unmuted.
Yes. So this is one of those meetings that sort of has everything in it. It has the Title VI program approval and the information about the zero emission bus project. And it's going to be very interesting to see moving forward how those things interact. As I think I've mentioned relating to Title VI, the challenge is, I think as Mr. Chang was pointing out, it's now kind of set up to do an overall view on how the agency is doing. And so so since the millage money is the routes things are going to happen, it's going to interact in interesting ways as you try to figure out how to manage both the capital expenses and how all of those things work together. It's going to be interesting, and I would just implore you to please think through how it's going to impact people who need to use the bus. As always, thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Mr. Mogensen. Deb, is there anyone else online? No, thank you. That closes public comment, and we will move on to general announcements. Do we have any general announcements this evening? Seeing none, we're just going to zip right on into the consent agenda. There are 3 items on the consent agenda. Does anybody want to move it into the record and make a motion to accept it as it is? Jesse moves to approve. Simi seconds. Any discussion on anything that's in the agenda? Seeing no discussion, we will move on for the vote. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And that also passed unanimously. Thank you, everyone. Now we're on to the ownership linkage portion of our agenda. Mr. Chang is not here, but he did send a report to me via email. He wanted to share that Matt presented to the Ann Arbor City Council on Monday, 10/16. It was primarily operational updates. We're hoping and predicting that we will eventually be able to have a presence from the board to hear the board's perspective, but right now the mayor just wishes to concentrate on operational, and I thought that it went very well. The second thing on that he wishes you all to know is that he sent an email to Mayor Brown of Ypsilanti. He feels that she's super busy right now. We think about what's happening in Ypsilanti. He has not yet received a response, but we are going to continue to work diligently to try to take a meeting with her. And that was everything from that. Now, is there anyone on the task force? Do we miss anything? Okay, seeing nothing, we will move on to monitoring. Monitoring task force update by Mr. Mike Alamang.
Thank you, Kathleen. The monitoring task force met on October 5. You have in your package tonight a resolution that we hope it can be passed. Actually, we discussed that at the last board meeting, and I think we got agreement on it, but we did not pass a resolution so that it could be modified in our monitoring, our policy manual. And specifically, that is to delete 2.7.2 out of the asset protection section because it's really redundant with 2.5.3, which is in the financial conditions section. And we did discuss that last time, and this might be the appropriate time, but I'd like to move approval of that motion in the board package.
Are there any questions for Mr. Alamang on what he's presented? Seeing none, does someone like to make a motion to eliminate 2.7.2.1 because it's redundant with 2.5 point, what was that? 1.3 or something?
2.5.3,
Okay. And adopting and removing 2.7.2.1. Would someone like to make a motion on that?
I think I moved.
Okay. Would someone like to second? That would be Ms. Kyra, thank you, and Ms. Sims, I apologize. And so all those in favor, please raise your hand. That was unanimous, and thank you, everyone.
Okay, well, thank you. Let me say a few
Yep.
other things that we did at our meeting. Rose Mercier had proposed, and I think I'd mentioned this at past board meetings, to restructure 2.4, which is financial planning and budgeting. And she thought that it could be broadened to really include all planning rather than just financial planning. And as part of that would be to fold into it 2.8, which is emergency CEO succession. As I said, she wanted this to really cover all planning, not just financial. And it was a very complex proposal that we discussed at several of our meetings. And the committee, the task force really wasn't convinced that that should be done. And so we are recommending that the review of 2.4 be addressed really as part of the detailed policy review and development process that we've talked about before and we've actually agreed upon. And that is 2 to 3 policies in the manual, the entire policy, not just sub-policies, be reviewed thoroughly, as I said, 2 to 3 per year, and that the governance committee should have the responsibility of recommending approximately at the beginning of the year what 2 to 3 projects or 2 to 3 policies should be thoroughly reviewed, and assign that thorough review to a committee, which could be the governance committee. So we also concluded really that we've accomplished pretty much all that we set out to do. And we are actually going to be recommending to the governance committee when it meets next that the task force be abolished. We have been operating for about 3 years, and I think we've accomplished a lot. We've had a lot of hard work from the people on that task force. 2 of the ones currently, besides myself, are Kyra and Kathleen, and we've been very amply and wonderfully supported by Rosa Maria and, of course, also Rose Mercier. And in the past, Rich was on the task force, and actually, a long time ago, Raymond Hess was on it. So anyway, 3 years of work, and I think we all feel good about what we've accomplished. We have a lot different procedures in the way to review monitoring reports, and it seems to be working pretty well. And so anyway, as I said, this might be the last time I give a report regarding the task force, assuming that it does get abolished, like we're going to be recommending. So that's pretty much everything we covered, I believe.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Well, as Mike pointed out, the task force has completed a lot of work over the last 3 years, and the governance committee is definitely going to take under consideration that it is time to put it to rest for now, but it's like any task force can be reconvened if something comes up in the future. So thank you, everyone, for all your work. Next is policy monitoring 5.1, the construction monitoring of 2.1.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The monitoring report for the construction policy is in your board packet on page 20. It was reviewed by the service committee, and they've recommended accepting it as a level A. We had 6 board members provide survey feedback. It's green all the way down the board. Very successful report. We didn't have a lot of construction over the last year, so there wasn't a lot going on for this particular policy, sleepy little policy this year. Hopefully that'll change. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions, but I turn it to the board for your decision.
Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Carpenter with regards to his report? Or any comments? Yes, Jesse.
I just want to call out specifically that the it's on page 34 of your packet. There's a CEO note, just a little bookkeeping CEO suggestion about whether 210.4 should be moved to be a part of 210.5. We did discuss that at service committee, but generally the feeling was that since we haven't had any major construction projects in place and to really test this, we didn't really want to make any changes to the, we're not recommending any changes to the policy until we've actually had a chance to do a thorough, well, basically use it before we start making changes to it.
Very good, thank you. Any other comments or questions? Yes, Mike.
I'd like to point out that on page 35, the next page from what Jesse referred to, is the last 3 years of this monitoring report. Even though there weren't any major projects in those years either, we went from a red and then 4 yellows, and now we're all green. And so obviously there's been good progress there, even though there hasn't been a project to really test the guts of the policy. So I'd like to propose that the board agrees on conclusion A, reasonable interpretation of all policy items, and that the evidence demonstrates compliance of the interpretations.
There's a motion on the floor. Do I have a second? That was Ms. Sims. And any more dialogue on this policy? Seeing none, or it should have been on the motion, I apologize. If there's no dialogue on the motion, we will go ahead and vote. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And thank you, everyone. That passed unanimously. Next on our agenda is zero emission buses and the recommendations from our CEO, Mr. Carpenter. We're just going to be a moment until we get things set up.
Am I working this from the keyboard? Okay. It's fine. Improvise, adapt, overcome. Well, good evening, board members, Madam Chair. It's nice to be here. This is a big evening for us. I hope we're all ready for a good conversation. So, my name is Matt Carpenter. I am the CEO of the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority. I'm here today to introduce our proposal for zero emissions bus propulsion technology. As I get started, I want to thank all of the staff and everyone else who's participated in the research and the development of this work to get it to this point. This is not the first time we've discussed it in public. There was a preliminary discussion, I think, 6 months ago or so. But it's been a work in progress for over a year, and I really want to thank Troy, George, Dina, Forrest, Jimmy. The list goes on. There's been just a lot of staff involved in this. So thank you all. There is a tremendous amount of information around this subject. I'm not going to try to cram all of it into what I'm going to say this evening. But we are trying to make sort of complementary information available to anyone watching online. One of the presentation I'll give this evening is a condensed version of a longer, more detailed recorded presentation that is available on our website, TheRide.org. If you look for the Zero Emissions Bus Initiative, there's a great project webpage here with a longer, more detailed presentation. You can watch it on double speed if you can handle that, or just download the scripted comments and read for yourself. There's a host of background research that we've been working on as well. So what I will try to do this evening is be concise, hit the highlights, enough for everyone to have a taste of the key issues involved, and then move to discussion. All right, so we'll follow roughly the same agenda as the online presentation. Quickly, let's talk about the timeline here. We've reverse engineered our timeline back from a grant opportunity that we have coming up in the spring. We don't know the exact deadline, but we think it's going to be March or April. It's the Federal Transit Administration's low-no emissions grant program. So we're working backwards from that deadline to bring this recommendation to you here in October. We anticipate you might want to discuss this for a couple of months. I will probably push you, if you haven't already come to consensus, push you by January. That's when my clock will start ticking on that grant deadline and decisions start to become more important. We'll talk about the exact authorizations that I'm going to ask you for in this presentation when we get there. So there are a few additional things in this presentation that are not in the online edition because this is focused to you, the board. A reminder for all of us of the instructions and expectations that you've given me. All of the work that we do has to fit within your policies, the policy manual. You have a number of goals that you've given me. You've had a number of parameters or limitations that you've provided, and we work within those guidelines on all our projects, including this one. So let's get into the technical proposal. What are we recommending? We are recommending a pilot project spanning 4 to 5 years, including the purchase of 2 hydrogen fuel cell buses, 1 outdoor fueling station, a lot of staff training, a very important part of this exercise. And if we are successful, this will to give us confidence to move towards hopefully a full transition of the fleet. And you'll hear me speak a little bit more about that this evening. But that is our ultimate goal. That's what we're trying to accomplish. So hopefully this will get us to there. Okay. There's some underlying themes that you're going to hear throughout this presentation. I'll be honest, there's an enormous amount of detail, technical discussions, ampage, voltage. We can go down any number of these rabbit holes. I'm trying to elevate this to what I think are probably the most important issues for this board to consider. And really, at the end of the day, I think there are kind of 2, risk tolerance and relative priority. Risk tolerance really comes back to action and inaction. What's the inaction that we're concerned about? We're concerned about climate change. It's a real thing. We can see it looking out the window. We have a potential in our fleet, transitioning our bus fleet to zero emissions, to eliminate 7,000 tons of carbon emissions every year. That's a huge benefit and something I think we should take very seriously. The risks of action, as we're going to talk about this evening, are simply there are risks involved in adopting a new technology, financial, as well as others, and we need to understand those as we move into this space. Other questions we need to accept, we're in a kind of transitionary period, I think, as a society and as an economy, going from a fossil fuel-based world, frankly, to something better. But we're not there yet. We're kind of in that in-between spot. There's a lot of competing ideas, a lot of great solutions being thrown around, but sometimes it's not entirely clear which one of them is actually going to be the best solution in the near future. As a result, we have a lot of information and sometimes conflicting information or competing information. We've recognized as staff there are a couple, there's a couple of key questions that we really could use answers for, and those answers simply don't exist yet. So as we go through this information, you'll see some of that. We'll also talk about a gap in the technology between what we want and need technology to be able to do for us in terms of great performance, reasonable cost, and eliminating emissions, that's what we need. And then there's the reality of where the technology is today. And it hits some of those pieces, but as we'll discuss, not all of them head on yet. A lot of this, also risk tolerance, really comes down to a question of financial commitments and investments that we are going to make. And that leads us right into the question of priorities. Because in a world where we have many needs and many wants, all of them very valid and reasonable, but limited resources, we, this board and your leadership team, have a duty to make priorities and difficult decisions. So we'll have to talk about the best way to eliminate emissions. Is it by zero emissions bus propulsion or increasing our ridership? Are there other things in our to-do list that we think should be priorities as well? I happen to think in our proposal that will thread the needle. I hope to convince you of that this evening in the next few months, to be able to do all of it within reason. In the online presentation, I spend a little bit of time going through what I call key concepts, and these are sort of fundamental principles or economic factors behind these. I'm not going to dwell on them this evening. The full presentation can walk you through the details. A couple of key things I just want to hit, though. We do see in your policies and through our interpretation of them a need to put the needs of the customers slightly ahead of the needs of the equipment. We run a transit system for customers. Our mission, as I understand it from your ends, is to help people have access to opportunities. That's our job. We try to reduce emissions as we do that, and that sort of gives you a relative priority. Carbon savings, as I've mentioned, is obviously the goal of this entire exercise. Full deployment, and what I mean there is full deployment of a bus propulsion. And you will hear the term full deployment. What I mean by that is this graph here, which we'll talk about a little bit later, just illustrating, we're not talking about 2 buses. We're not talking about 6 buses. We're talking about we need a strategy that can scale up to roughly 200, because that's where we see our fleet growing in the time scale that we're discussing here. So that's the sort of scale of a solution we need. We're going to talk about energy density and travel range, how far different fuels can take us. In a nutshell, fossil fuels, as polluting as they are, have great energy density and can really take a vehicle a long way. Batteries have a lower energy density, and hydrogen's kind of in the middle. That has a huge effect on our operations and our service to our customers. That brings us to fleet management. There's just a whole lot of behind-the-scenes, costly management of a fleet of 103 buses that's growing. We have to do that cost effectively in a way that continues to make sure service goes well to customers consistently, reliably. And so there's a lot of nuance to that and the potential for hidden costs if we're not cautious. So let's talk about the technologies that we've been looking at. I'm not going to speak about diesel technology, except to say that it's our status quo option. It's what we buy today. And as better as the engines have gotten, and they are much cleaner than they used to be, they do not have the potential to become zero emissions. They'll never get to zero because they are diesel engines. Battery electric buses and hydrogen fuel cell electric buses are the ones we've focused on during this period, so let's talk about them briefly. Again, there's much more detail on these online. I'm going to try to hit some of the key highlights. Battery electric bus is exactly what the name suggests. It has large lithium-ion batteries on the roof. It is charged either from a familiar plug-in or an industrial ceiling-mounted catenary system that drops down to charge it. It's exactly what you would expect. Battery electric buses, just to summarize the pros and cons, they have the widest range of best case scenario and worst case scenario of the technologies that we've looked at. In the best case scenario, they have enormous potential. They're the most energy efficient in some respects. They have the potential for the lowest cost. They have the fewest moving parts for the mechanics to have to fix. So they may have the least maintenance. On the worst case scenario, however, is fairly significant with the technology we have today. They could have the highest costs, and this comes from the potential for fleet growth, and this comes back immediately to energy density and questions of range. If we simply can't meet our minimum operational requirements, with what battery electric buses can do, then we may have to buy extra buses to maintain the same amount of service. That leads to fleet growth. That leads to inefficiencies in the fleet management system, so hidden operational costs of simply shuttling buses back and forth. It could lead to the need for a new garage, simply because our garage today is full. All of this could distract us from focusing on the customer, because now we're taking a lot of care and attention on the propulsion system that presently we don't have to do today. Challenges for battery electric buses: the range and heating are the primary ones, and it comes back to the energy density of a lithium-ion battery. One of the things we've learned is that because the heating for a bus in a cold weather climate, it's like a space heater. It has to pull from the same battery that's propelling the bus, so that pulls the range down. Some agencies have had to put a gasoline-fired cabin heater in the back of the bus just to keep people warm while it's driving. So these are kind of examples of not very elegant workarounds or Band-Aids that we're seeing in the industry as we try to figure out how to use these technologies. If we can address some of these issues, the batteries can still work, but we have challenges with scaling, as we could talk about. Managing the batteries themselves and the charging of it is quite complex and a new idea for us. The amount of time it takes to charge a battery, 4 to 5 hours, that has implications for fleet management and customer services. The pricing of the electricity itself, and the resiliency of the electrical grid. Earlier this year, some of us may remember, we had a significant snowstorm. There was a power outage in Ann Arbor. Our garage was without electricity for, I think, at least 5 days. If we had been a battery-powered fleet at that time, service probably would have stopped after about 24 hours. As it was, our diesel-powered fleet kept going. So there may be some logic at the diversification of our energy systems going forward. We don't have to stay with diesel, but moving into other things, we should keep that in mind. However, and this is the frustrating thing for me about the battery technology, it's so close. There's been so many improvements in the battery technology in recent years. Its capacity has improved, the range has improved. It's not good enough yet, but if there were a breakthrough, if there were some technological patent soon that could break through this barrier, batteries have tremendous potential, possibly enough to put hydrogen in its grave. So this is a not insignificant consideration. The challenge there is the if battery technology has a breakthrough, because we don't know if and when that will occur. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about hydrogen fuel cell electric buses. Also an electric bus. Hydrogen gas is stored on the roof in compressed tanks. It is used to fed into a fuel cell, which generates electricity, which charges a much smaller battery, which then powers the wheel. Heating is done off the fuel cell. Apparently it heats up, and so we can use what we call parasitic heating to heat the passenger cabin. Importantly, there's a single fuel pump in the building rather than a number of these sort of drop-down or plug-in chargers. And as we will discuss in a moment, hydrogen can be produced in a number of different ways. Hydrogen's got some good things and some bad things, just like, some strengths and weaknesses, just like any technology. Most importantly, it meets our minimum operating requirements. I want to be clear. It cannot match the operational performance of diesel. Can't do that. But it doesn't have to. It has to meet a minimum operational requirement for a mass transit system. We believe it can do that. So what that means is it preserves service to customers, no impact to them. We can still design the services for their convenience, not the convenience of the propulsion system. It probably will not lead to fleet growth, so the need for a new garage is moot. However, there are some significant challenges. Right now, the biggest challenge has to do with the fuel itself, the hydrogen. Right now, it's 2 to 5 times more expensive than diesel. We can absorb that for a small duration pilot project. We cannot absorb that kind of cost in our operating budget for full deployment. So that has to be addressed, or this technology may be a dead end. However, if the supply grows, and this forecast here is an example of some of the, I don't want to say scientific speculation that we're seeing out there in various periodicals. If the supply of hydrogen grows, the cost should come down. which is a reasonable market-based sort of assumption. I want to address the question of where hydrogen comes from and how it's made, the recipes, because I know this is very important and it has a lot to do with how clean is this solution ultimately. Hydrogen is not an energy source. Like a battery, it is a way of porting the energy, storing it, moving it from one place to another. It can be produced in a number of ways, but you have to have electricity to generate the hydrogen. That electricity can be created from any number of sources: nuclear, fossil fuels, green energy. Right now, most hydrogen today is created by burning natural gas. And today, I mean in the United States. That makes it what they call gray hydrogen. Arguably, it's even dirtier than just using electricity in that respect. So there's a downside there. Blue hydrogen is the same thing, but they capture the carbon emissions and they attempt to store it, eject it into the ground or some other carbon sink. Green hydrogen, the electricity to create the hydrogen, is made from renewable sources, solar or wind. Hydrogen, what it lacks in efficiency in this regard, because you have to use electricity to ultimately make electricity, so there is some loss along the way, so there is a efficiency deficit there. It makes up for in the energy density when you're in a vehicle that has to haul your own fuel. This argument may not apply to buildings, for example, that can be hooked up permanently to a plug or a grid, but for vehicles, there's an additional consideration. There are two things about this slide that I know are out there in the community. We've heard them and we want to hit head on. The first is where should our concern be? Should it be with emissions produced at the tailpipe of a bus or upstream at the generation facility? This, I would say, is kind of a philosophical question that we all have to sort of discuss. I've heard different things in our industry recently. Some saying, yes, absolutely, we should consider the totality, the wells to wheels generation of it. Others saying, look, we're the transit industry. We run buses. Let's focus on what we can control, which is the tailpipe and the bus attached to it. The other things, the generation of electricity, the generation of hydrogen, those are macroeconomic things that are way outside our ability to influence. We have to let the market take care of that, or let the government take care of that. So I don't know that I have a strong feeling one way or the other, but I think that's a decision point we're going to have to address in this discussion. The other thing I want to hit head on is some comments we've heard about whether or not hydrogen is genuinely green. And I think this is important for us to understand. There is a feeling that hydrogen, to say it directly, is a front for the fossil fuel industry, that it takes so much natural gas to create hydrogen that it's really just a backdoor way of continuing to sell fossil fuels. We have heard that, we understand that, but we also acknowledge that we are in this weird transitionary period in our society and economy where a perfect solution, a magic bullet, really hasn't become obvious to us yet. We're probably going to need to try multiple solutions, and having bridging strategies starts to make sense. What's a bridging strategy? Maybe we can't get everything on day one, but we can get the pieces starting to be in place so that we'll have a temporary Band-Aid or a temporary interim solution for a little while until a better solution comes along. In this context, we might have to start with dirtier electricity or dirtier hydrogen until green stuff really becomes available. That's not an us problem, that's a society problem. On that point, as we went to press with our presentation on Friday, the federal government came out with some, I think, relevant and important announcements. Former Governor Granholm, who's the Secretary of Energy, announced the winners of the Energy Department's contest for hydrogen hubs. They had been soliciting proposals across the country to create hydrogen generation facilities. They picked 7, including one in the Midwest, which includes apparently a facility at the Willow Run Airport, specifically the American Center for Mobility, which some of us may remember is also in the business of testing autonomous vehicles. Troy and I, head of the Fleet Department, had actually spoken to their president a year ago about this. So he's not a recent convert to this. He's been working on this for some time. The potential to have a hydrogen generation facility 11 miles from our garage is certainly an important one. We're going to be watching it very seriously. We don't know all the details of it. They haven't released the specifics. But what they are intentionally, with this program, attempting to lower the costs of hydrogen, which you remember I said was a big issue for us. So they're trying to do that with this, with these grants. And they are specifically targeting what they call hard to decarbonize sectors, like heavy-duty manufacturing and heavy-duty transportation, where hydrogen has the best chance of being a new sort of zero emissions fuel or energy conduit. So we're certainly going to be watching that with great interest. So summary on the conclusions, and you've seen this table, this graph before. No matter which one we do, we're going to be moving out of a low risk scenario into a higher risk scenario. There's no magic bullet here. There's no way to eliminate all the risk. Neither technology, frankly, is entirely ready. There are some key questions we've identified that we probably won't know the answers to, frankly, for a few years. It's going to take time for us as a society to figure these things out. There is a risk here. I'm going to date myself with this analogy. There is a risk here of what we used to call the VCR Betamax issue, and the younger crowd might know better as a Facebook MySpace thing, that these two technologies are kind of competing with each other right now for heavy-duty transportation markets. It's not yet clear which one of them will win out. Some of us were at an industry conference a couple weeks ago, and the message from our industry is very mixed. We see people with battery electric fleets doubling down on it. We see folks with battery electric fleets moving away from them, having to buy diesels or converting to hydrogen. We heard some interesting discussions about the possibility of having mixed fleets within one agency, which is a kind of bizarre concept. I hadn't heard anyone credibly argue for that before. And frankly, some of these decisions may come down to very local conditions. Do we live near a large hydroelectric dam where energy is relatively cheap and has zero emissions? If the answer is yes, maybe battery electric buses look better. If you don't, maybe you have to make a different decision. Honestly, even the topography of a community and the amount of hills has an effect on energy consumption and acceleration. So we could end up 10 years from now in a situation where the bus fleet that today is almost entirely diesel has fragmented into a bunch of different types of propulsion systems, mostly based on hyper-local conditions. This is what I mean about the transitionary period. We don't quite know yet exactly where this is going to end up. So our recommendation, after looking at all this technology, and again, way more details on the website, we're recommending hydrogen for a couple of key reasons. Number one, the technology works today. Out of the box, a hydrogen bus, it's older, it's been around a bit longer. And when I mean works today, it meets our minimum operational requirements for running a mass transit system. That's primarily driven by the energy density and the range. What that means is that our fleet won't grow, and we can continue to develop services with our customers' convenience and comfort first in mind. Both hydrogen and battery kind of need some breakthroughs, or breakouts, if you will. Battery needs a technology breakthrough, the solid state battery, or something that we've heard about for many years. Hydrogen needs a market breakthrough, an economic breakthrough. They need more supply out there. They need more people buying it in order to mature that market and reduce its costs. It is safe. We know that many people hear the word hydrogen and it has connotations. I want to assure you this, the industrial application of hydrogen has come a long way in the last 100 years, and we are only aware of very small numbers of incidents that have occurred. And we feel in our industry, in the transportation industry, safety is no longer a serious concern. Scalability matters here as well. Hydrogen scales better. I want to take just a second to talk about why, what do I mean by that. For battery electric buses, they've been very prominent recently because the incremental cost of buying a handful of them is relatively low. You can buy a plug, a charger. Doing a few of them is not a big deal. Doing a lot of them, because they take 4 to 5 hours to charge, you have to do that overnight. That means one of those drop-down automatic chargers for every bus. So there's no economies of scale in the fueling or charging of it. Compare that to a diesel or hydrogen bus where there's one large fueling station. No matter how big your fleet grows, you still just got the one fueling station. So there's an economy there. Every time you buy a battery electric bus, you have to buy all the wiring, the drop-down system. It just effectively increases the incremental cost of every bus. And again, looking at the scale of the fleet that we already are, we're probably already into the territory where economically a single fueling station makes a lot of sense. And as we continue to grow in coming years, that factor will just become more important. So why a pilot project as opposed to immediate full deployment? There's a couple of reasons for this logic. First is we're pretty confident in this technology from what we've heard, but we're not 100% confident. We need to learn. We need to learn from this, to get hands-on experience with the technology, so that if and when we decide to buy more of them, we don't have a learning curve to deal with there. What do we mean by that? It is different fueling a diesel bus than fueling a hydrogen bus. Our fueling crews have to learn, develop entirely new procedures for how we're going to deal with that. The mechanic's job changes a lot. There is a lot to learn there. Driving one of these buses is remarkably different. If you got a lead foot, you take the battery down faster. In a diesel power, you just don't notice it because the fuel tank is so big. In these things, it might matter. So there's a lot we need to learn. A pilot project also allows us to have some tangible, visible progress on the street here in our community for people to look and see and touch. Tangible evidence of us making forward progress on what is important to this board, to your policies, and to the community. The pilot project does minimize our initial risk. We're letting some time pass so some of these things can sort themselves out in the broader market. If for some reason hydrogen turns out to not be the right thing, we haven't made a huge investment, but it sort of minimizes the risk at the outset. If we're successful, however, we will all develop a greater deal of confidence that this is a technology that can work for us and it's the right deal. We'll also allow, frankly, more time to see if any alternative has a breakthrough that we might want to consider instead. But my intention here, I want to be clear, is that this is not a study project. This is the first step of a full deployment. That's how we are treating it as staff, a slow first deployment. The timeline, it's in the presentation online. I don't want to go into it in too detail, except to note there are key steps. We're working backwards from the grant award, some key authorizations from you that I'll go into in more detail. If we are successful, we'll find out in about a year from now. We can begin some implementation immediately for training, for example, but the procurement process for these zero emissions buses right now is still a bit of a problem. There are back orders for hydrogen and electric buses going into 24 months. That's a result of the pandemic's impacts on supply chains, of a lot of transit agencies rushing the door and jamming up the order books. We've also lost Novabus as an American manufacturer, something that was been discussed with great concern at APTA earlier this month. So that's the biggest wild card in here in terms of how fast we can actually get buses here, and it's frankly out of our control. Oh, but if I might, full deployment there at the bottom. There is a decision beyond this. I want to reiterate this. There's a decision beyond this pilot project where we would be here again talking about the pilot project, the results of the pilot, things that have developed in the economy since the buses had been running. Are we ready to begin a full deployment? That we think that discussion is somewhere in 2028 or 2029. A lot depends on how much we can compact this timeline and shorten it up. Okay, let's talk money. A About the pilot project specifically, I'm going to talk about full deployment in a moment. Total project cost here somewhere between $7 and $11 million. We are presenting this as a range right now because of the uncertainty inherent in some of the numbers we're seeing. We're still getting a lot of conflicting information from various sources about exactly how much this is going to cost. It is my intent to tighten this up to one number for you to consider going forward, but I'm giving you the range, and we're going to tighten this up as tight as we can, as fast as we can. But this is where we're starting right now, and credit to staff. They have done a tremendous amount of work, very thorough in terms of making sure that we've got everything in here that we need to. Capital costs are very important here, as are operating costs. We have a real advantage here ahead of us with this low-no grant. The federal government for transit usually gives you 50 cents on the dollar. For this one, they're talking 80 cents. That's a good deal. If we can get that, I think we should. That means our capital implication here is $1.1 to $1.5 million. That's not bad, frankly, for what we're talking about here. However, the operating cost of 1.4 to 3.3, and by the way, these are rounded numbers, so they're, I know there's at least one discrepancy in my video between what I said and what is on here, and I apologize for that. The operating cost is primarily driven by the cost of the hydrogen fuel itself. It also includes staff training, parts, things of this sort. No, excuse me, parts are capital. Tools, sorry. That, we have to own that. We're gonna pay 100% of the operating costs. The feds don't contribute anything for that. So total cost to us, looking around right now, $2.5 to $4.8 million over the 4 to 5 year part of the process. Right now, the best and frankly only way to fund this that we see is out of the capital reserve. The capital reserve is something we've been building up for a couple of years. It does us no good sitting in a bank. We need to spend it. We need to get some solutions on the road for people, for our customers. That's where that money is best suited. We've got a couple of projects already in the pipeline we'll talk about. I'm going to suggest that this one also be added to that pipeline. And that brings me to the pipeline and the other priorities, and I think a very important, if risk tolerance was the first one, priorities is the other. We also have, and this board approved, a 25-year long-range transit plan focused on growing ridership, increasing social mobility and equity. Yes, growing ridership to reduce single occupant vehicles and reduce carbon emissions. That was explicitly part of it. But also labor mobility, customer satisfaction, and public perception of the agency. A lot of that had to do with increasing the frequency of service and bringing our infrastructure up to a point where it can handle that. The capital projects from that plan include major upgrades at both bus terminals, bus rapid transit, a garage to house those vehicles, and various IT and fare collection and information systems. All of those are also considered capital projects, durable goods, you might want to think about it that way. The infrastructure grants from the feds are competitive. We're very fortunate that the federal government here is so generous in giving grants. That is a great thing, but they are competitive, they are not guaranteed, and you have to bring a local match to the table. That you can't just walk in with nothing. They want to see the local agency bring, ante up, bring some of your money to the table as well. As I'm going to go to in a minute, we believe, Dean and I have talked about this extensively, short term, our funding is adequate. We can fund this pilot without any major disruptions to the other projects that are on our plate. Longer term, we're clearly insufficient, and there's some challenges with that. So at this point, I want to refer you to a handout that you received. This is the 10-year capital plan. It was approved by the board in the budget. It is also available online. I believe it is an attachment to the issue brief on the website. This is all of the capital spending that we're anticipating. You see in the yellow lines what has been added. Previously, there were kind of placeholders or blanks in these cells. We've begun to populate this. What's it going to cost to do this for the pilot project, and then beginning estimates about future years. This table is complicated. It's got a lot of things going on, so I want to introduce a new graph to you. You have it at your place, and we will be attaching it to this presentation after the meeting. We are trying here to find new tools, new communication tools to help make sense of that confusing table. I hope that this graph begins to get into it. Let me orient you to what this is trying to show. In a world of a lot of wants and needs and limited resources, we know we're going to have to set priorities. Like I said, we're lucky the feds will chip in as much money as they do, but we have to bring local match to the table. The local match is our limiting factor. That will determine how many of these capital grants that we can get for all of the projects we want. So this graph illustrates only the major projects from the capital plan that came from the long-range plan that are eligible for the competitive grants, BRT, garage, IT technology, hubs, and yes, zero emissions propulsion. It also illustrates in red our local match capacity, what we have, and what we're going to need going forward. Now, on the left-hand side of the table, you can see the, not a triangle, the area. That represents the money in our capital reserve today. You can see between 2024 and 2027 that our local capital reserve can help fund project development for the 2 terminals, a couple of studies, and the zero emissions pilot project there in green before the reserve is depleted. That's important. Starting in 2028, it goes negative. What does that mean? That means in order to continue all the other projects downstream of that, which includes all of the long-range plan projects and most of the zero emissions projects, that dotted red bars hanging off the bottom represents the amount of funding we will need to find to bring to the table to provide the local match. As I said, the local matching funds are the limiting factor that will constrain our ability to build major projects or fully deploy zero emissions buses. In a sense, and I've been asked, is the zero emissions project competing with another project? I want to be clear with this. In a sense, kind of, if you look at it this way, but in another sense, we don't have funding for any of these major projects, the garage, the BRT, or the ZEB implementation. The money runs out too early. So until we solve that problem, there's no sense in the projects, fighting, quite frankly. I want to reassure everybody that, I know this is a little intimidating to look at it and to look at how much money we're short in our wish list. I want to assure you that this is normal. Even the dollar amounts are not that scary. 3 or 4 years ago, we really wanted to build a new Ypsi Transit Center and we had no money. We had no idea how we were going to do it. Now we have a $7 million earmark and a flush capital reserve. Things can happen. Our job here at this agency is to come up with the right list of projects. Make sure we are certain that that's what this community needs, that those are the priorities. To develop those projects as best we can, the funders like to see a good cost estimate. And then we go out and find the money for the things we know we need and we want for this community. So I don't want anyone to be intimidated here. I'm not intimidated by this. Yes, we got to go find the money. More importantly, are these the right projects, the right sequence? I want to emphasize that this graph is illustrative only. This is the Mark I version of this from Dina and I. We've already caught some things we want to change. We've had to make a lot of simplifications in this, over focus on just a couple of things. There's nothing on operating in here at all, for example. I wouldn't want anyone to come away from this graph thinking that this is a final plan. It's a work in progress. It will change, every year this is going to change. So I don't want anyone to overemphasize this. It is not a final decision or recommendation. I think the takeaway here is that with the reserve as it is right now, we can fund the orange, which is the Ypsilanti Transit Center construction. That's the big project that's frankly ahead of it in the queue. Some of the smaller studies and work, and we can fund this pilot project. We will be working over the next few years to frankly find more money for the YTC and find other ways to grow the reserve. But right now, this is where we stand. All right, as I said at the beginning, there's a lot of details here. I think the main action is on these two questions, risk tolerance and priorities. A couple closing comments. So, to be clear about it, it's my job to give you a recommendation, and I'm giving it to you. I recommend a hydrogen pilot project grant proposal. I believe it is more practical today, and it's better suited to a full deployment going forward. I don't want to get into a situation like we've seen in some other agencies. I'll give you a few examples. Reno, Nevada, one of the early adopters of battery electric buses, the range considerations that I mentioned to you are not hypothetical. These are actual problems that actual agencies are hitting. They've had to stop buying battery electric buses, switch back to diesel while the hydrogens are on order because they've hit that range limitation. In Denver, they made a big announcement about going all electric and then had to walk it back 15 months later when they realized it was going to cause them to have to build numerous more garages. So they're kind of had to fall back and start over. I don't want to waste time. I don't want to waste money. I think this is the path that has it's not a wide path, it's a narrow path. I'm going to be clear with you, we have some obstacles here. But I believe it is a path that is viable. A pilot project can get us a tangible, visible symbol of agency commitment. It minimizes our risk today and allows time for the technology and the markets to evolve. It also, frankly, allows time for government to figure out how it's going to fund the next wave of this stuff. It puts a clear date on full deployment, 2028, 2029. That's what we're looking for that next big decision. And it is affordable. It's a great deal, 80 cents on the dollar. That's the kind of thing we should be going for. It aligns with your policies. It aligns with the goals, the values of the community. I do want to add one other thing here that I think has fallen off this slide. It has to do with our ability to continue forward with the long-range plan. The federal government has tie-barred a commitment, a sort of soft commitment to zero emissions to some of the other grants we need, particularly grants for garages and BRT. We can't apply for those garages until we've taken some demonstrable steps on this issue. So that's, I need to make clear with you, we can't move forward on the biggest parts of increasing the frequency of bus service because we can't get a garage until we do something here. So there is a natural sequence that's evolving. It's artificial, but the grant creators can do that. It is their money. All right, back to the timeline real quick. We're reverse engineering from a grant deadline. I want to talk to you, board members, about what I will ask of you. In addition to your thoughts and feedbacks and this conversation and discussion going forward. I believe I'm going to need two kinds of votes from you, and I do think it's probably going to end up being votes. The first, I'm going to ask for in January, if not before. This is what I would characterize as a soft commitment from you. I need to know that this proposal has your general support. I don't want to get out ahead of you. I don't want to be doing something that you do not support. So I think we have until January, until I kind of need to know. I think a mechanism for that may be in the construction policy that we just reviewed, because grant submissions with construction components to it need your authorization. So I may use that mechanism to seek your approval through a vote. I don't know if it's strictly necessary, but I may ask for it nonetheless. Shortly thereafter, that basically tells me I can spend the time, effort, and staff resources to develop this grant proposal. Frankly, I'll probably start working on it tomorrow, but I need to know by January if I'm going down a dead end. By February or March, I need a firmer commitment from you. The FTA requires the board to approve what they call a transition plan, which is a somewhat fuzzy, soft promise about converting to zero emissions. It's not a hard commitment, we're not bound by it, but it's basically a statement of intent. that I cannot apply for this grant without that transition plan, and only you can approve that transition plan. So I will need you to approve that. It's just basically documentation about things like transition time and are you going to help us pay for this and things like that. We can talk about it more. And then finally, if we're going to fund this from the capital reserve, including operations, which is a little, first time we've used a reserve, I cannot withdraw funds from the capital reserve without your authorization. So I will need a commitment from you so that Dina can build that into future budgets knowing that that decision has been made. Okay, we're wrapping it up here. Next steps. Board discussion starts here. Can go as long as you need it to go. You can make your decisions at any time. January is sort of my end date. I'm really curious as to what else you need. What new information should we bring in November? What additional information would you want to help you grapple with this, to understand it? We are going to be refining those cost estimates. Those ranges need to narrow down. We owe that to you. The priority implications, we're going to keep working on that graph as well. Collecting public feedback. We've actually had an active week on our website. We've had a number of people watch the video. I've received about 6 public comments already through the online forum, which is wonderful. So we're going to be monitoring that and sharing those feedbacks with you as well. And next discussion will be at the November board meeting, of course. Public feedback, always welcome. Anyone who's watching online, we welcome you to visit our website, look at the project page under Zero Emissions Bus Initiative. A tremendous amount of detail, a video that I'm sure is better at time and a half or double speed than watching me at regular time, and a great opportunity to submit comments. I read all of them. We will be passing them along to the board. And you can also, of course, attend this meeting and make a public comment as well. So with that, Madam Chair, that's, believe it or not, a short version of the presentation. Happy to begin the discussion and dialogue with you.
Thank you, Mr. Carpenter. We're going to open it up to the board for questions, and it's my understanding that you'll not be the only one fielding questions, but also staff, Dina, Troy,
I will be
and whatnot.
calling a friend.
Awesome, awesome. So let's go ahead and open up to the board. Who'd like to go first? Don't be shy. Susan?
So I have a few, I don't know if this is registering, but I have a few questions. I want to make sure I'm getting up to speed. The first one is you shared information about the dirty hydrogen versus the electric that's pretty much already there. And it's my understanding the University of Michigan has already made a decision to go all electric. They made the decision in 2021. And they've already begun to acquire those electric buses. It's the decision to go fully electric by 2035, which will be about the time we're only going to get started on our plan. They will have already gone all in. What do they know that we don't know? Why is a comparable system in our town going that direction, and we would go with dirty hydrogen instead? I don't
Sure.
understand if the goal is to pursue a sustainability goal, why, if you've emphasized dirty hydrogen, would we not explore electric at this point,
Sure.
as the university has?
First, as a clarification, I do think it's possible we would start with the dirty energy, whether that comes from DTE's grid or hydrogen. My hope is that in either case, we would transition to a fully clean, utterly renewable source. So I think everyone hopes for that. Now, I don't want to put words in the U of M's mouth. I don't speak for them. I could make speculative conjectures about some of their things. What do they know that we don't? That they have a $10 billion endowment, and this to them is a rounding error. For us, it's a life or death financial decision. It's a big deal for us. For them, it is not. I sincerely hope their experiment, and you're right, they do, I believe, have, is it 3 or 4? 3? So they have 3 New Flyer battery electric buses, and one of them is a Artec. So they do have them. I think I saw one of them running, and it's actually really good because they get to, frankly, pilot that while we're looking at the other major contender. So I think there's some validity in that. Their route structure is much different than ours. Shorter, smaller footprint. It's really between Main and North Campus is the majority of it. They may have, so I think that's a big difference as opposed to going all the way to Ypsi, 45-minute run back and forth. I think the operating environment is different. They may have more opportunities to do what we call en route charging, where there's a, if I can find a picture here. So where the bus, if it's laying over, can recharge with a drop-down thing like this. They may be able to pull that off. I have a lot of concerns about that particular thing in our environment. And they, might be making a mistake. Then this gets back to the uncertainty inherent in this decision. I don't know which one of these technologies ultimately 10 years from now is going to completely win out. I do know that over the last 3 years, a lot of agencies have bought the battery ones, frankly, because they're cheap at the beginning, at a small number. They've made a commitment, as I understand it, to go zero emissions, and they may have also said electric. They may change their minds. I don't know. So I think the most important thing, however, is that the financial risk for them is just fundamentally different. It's so small compared to the resources they have available.
Sort of a follow-up. As I was looking at it, they're not actually using an endowment of any kind. They're issuing bond debt. They're financing sustainability endeavors through a green bond totaling $300 million. So I've raised this before with our budget process. Why are we not bonding for our big capital projects? Why do we wait till we have pennies in the piggy bank and only then proceed? The timeline, I absolutely get that, but it's not some donor giving them dollars, they're issuing debt. Why are we unable to issue debt?
And yes, you have mentioned this before, and I'd be happy to entertain a conversation with the board as part of this process going forward. The board has discussed bonding in the past. We do have a legal ability to do it. The challenge is really what's the revenue source that's paying for the bond. We can't do it out of our existing millage dollars because all of that is spoken for. We have done some preliminary research, and it goes back a couple years. We'd have to speak with our council. It may be possible for this agency to have a separate sinking fund millage to provide money to back a bond. That may be a possibility. We'd have to check with lawyers. I do have a concern about the mill rate that would be necessary to generate enough money to plug some of these holes. I don't know. I'd be interested in learning about what the university's capacity is, but I see no reason we couldn't have that conversation as part of this.
I have another question, which is the presentation talks that it's going to take 5 years, and at that point, we'll see if it's been successful. Can you tell me what are the metrics that you and the staff are going to use to determine if we are successful? What does success look like in 5 years versus what we already know today?
Excellent question. So we have had our mechanics going on field trips to various transit agencies throughout the Midwest. They have been to Flint and Champaign-Urbana to look at the hydrogen buses. And my understanding was it was the first time they had a crew of just mechanics out there instead of like the VIP tour circuit. I believe we've learned very quickly, we've caught up with kind of like industry knowledge. The next step for us is the hands-on experience. I have promised the mechanics that I wouldn't make this recommendation to you until I knew their thoughts. I didn't mention it here today, but Troy has been working with his staff. He gave me a white paper about the feedback from the mechanics that was incorporated in here. If they had waved me off of hydrogen, we'd be having a different conversation today. They effectively said, diesel still looks like the best thing for now, but if we had to pick one, hydrogen would be the next thing. That comes from book learning, that comes from a few field trips. We need hands-on experience. We also need to learn how to fuel these buses. It's a very different procedure. In both cases, I believe, I'm pretty confident. Other places do this. We can learn how to do this. I'm not too worried. The maturation of the market for hydrogen is one of the big question marks. How long is it going to take for the price to come down? How long is it going to take for clean hydrogen to really become available? I don't know the details of what they're planning to do in Willow Run. Is it blue hydrogen, gray hydrogen, green hydrogen, I don't know. So I think some time to let those exterior markets mature is important. I would say as a success factor, that's a key point, because if we love the technology and we can't afford to fuel it, that's kind of a big deal. If the board decides that the emissions generated from the generation of the energy to start with are in scope and must be considered, and that's not going to work out in a timely manner, that could also be a deal killer. So there's a number of things that we can learn hands-on. I also think the drivers need a chance with it. As I've mentioned, even changing manufacturers from the one diesel bus to another, there's a lot of back and forth there. So I think there's a lot for us to learn, get real hands-on experience, and my intent of that is that that's what we use to scale up rapidly. We learn how to fuel 2 buses so that we can learn how to fuel 103 of them. We've done some preliminary math. We think we need 3 fueling stations to do it. It takes a little bit longer. So things like this have to be sorted out. So getting through all of that and getting to the end of it, looking at the numbers, and all of us having confidence that that's the right thing to do, that's success in my mind.
Thank you. So I'm not quite sure that I got the answer to metrics. We'll have a gut feeling when we know we've gotten there. Maybe I'm interpreting incorrectly.
We haven't nailed down specific metrics, but
What
I suspect
success,
they will
yeah.
think, operating cost per mile or hour.
Okay,
Customer feedback, driver feedback, mechanic feedback, wrench time. How long does it take to actually fix it? Is it different to do a brake job on this thing than it is a diesel bus? Shouldn't be, but how long does it take to replace a fuel cell? We use a number of statistics like that. I think the mechanics area, frankly, is going to be where most of the hard KPIs come from. We use a stat called mean distance between failure, so just how often does it break down? It's a basic thing, but we would need to compare that to a diesel bus to assess reliability. Dina's going to have to run cost per hour, cost per mile calculations, make sure that it's all in costs and we're not leaving anything on the cutting room floor that shouldn't be. So that's probably where we'll get next, but I appreciate the question. Sorry, I don't have a
no,
prepared answer for that.
that's sort of a follow-up to what you just said. Could we get a breakout of what $7.5 to $11 million gets us? Because what I'm hearing is 2 buses in 5 years. I would love to know what that means. Are they replacement buses to existing buses? Are they new buses? What is $11 million? I don't understand the expense for the pilot.
Sure, we can absolutely bring a breakdown of these costs next time, if that's all right.
Oh, that'd be great.
I will share with you at this point that all of these buses cost more than a diesel bus.
Oh, you shared that
Yeah.
earlier.
So I think we're looking at 1.1, 1.2 million for a hydrogen bus, a little less for a battery bus. The fueling stations are not an insignificant cost as well. It's a completely separate piece of infrastructure that we don't have today. So that's a serious contributor to the cost as well.
But of the 11 million, if the feds are providing 80%, the cost to us would be 20%
Yeah.
of 11 million. But yeah, you'll break out what
We
that
can
is.
break that out for you.
That'd be helpful. I'm sorry to hog it. I have a couple more.
We have plenty of time.
Yeah, well, thank you.
This is what it's for.
I had a concern about the timeline, I'm getting to it already. Again, by the time we're ready to start making a decision, the university will be almost done. It feels like 5 years isn't quite clear to me why it takes 5 years to get to that place. And I, see the chart on the other obligations financially. But again, if what we're looking at is a 20% against an 80%, I guess I need to understand more how it takes 5 years to get to a point and how it's competing if we move the timeline up a little bit. So I'd like a little bit more on that
Sure.
before the next meeting. My next question was, I think you touched on it, because there's only 2 bus manufacturers, all these timelines, how solid are they if we're competing with other agencies who are also looking for these buses?
Yep.
Which led to that was why I was looking into the university. If we could co-purchase, would that help us to get in a queue with 4 buses versus 2, just to give ourselves a little bit of leeway if we're working with, say, the public schools or some other agency? Let me see what else. Are you asking the board to approve whole hog the proposal? Are you giving the board an opportunity to modify the proposal? Or what, are we rubber stamping, or are you asking us to modify this? I don't know quite what our role is. I know that you need approval to submit
Sure.
a grant, but if this is the proposal, is it, this is what we're gonna keep see, but we'll just get more information?
And this is an excellent question, and part of the reason I need sort of clarity from you guys if we're heading in the right direction. It's my obligation to give you my best professional judgment, and that's what this recommendation is. I serve at the pleasure of the board. If you want to do something else, you can. If you choose to do something different than what I have recommended, I and my staff will do our best to make it work. I want to make that commitment.
The internet stations will automatically shut off at 7:55. Please make any final copies at this time and take all materials to be checked out to a self-check station or to the circulation desk by 7:55. Thank you.
The precise mechanism for your approval, I mean, that's kind of up to you. I think it needs a vote because I think it's an important decision and it shouldn't be kind of done, willy-nilly. And if in that process you guys choose to change the recommendation or direct me to make a different proposal, that is your right. And we'll do our best to help you, be successful with that.
And as a piece of it, you will be giving us that transition plan that we will also be approving? What that looks like, how many buses,
Yeah.
when, when will we see that?
So that is, in a lot of ways, really just a documentation of the decisions you've made. It's, when you make your decisions, we then write the plan to meet your decisions. So I want to make sure the cart and the horse are in the right order. I'll get you the recipe. I'll let you know exactly what it requires, but it's things like, where is it? Excuse me. How long until you're going to transition? What's your timeline? What's your financial commitment? How much money are you bringing to the table? Questions like this. Again, I would characterize it as sort of a soft commitment that the feds are asking for, not a hard, we promise forever to do this. It's more of, this is our intent. But again, it's based on what your decision is. We can write it up to meet whatever your decision is. But I'll get you the recipe for what they want to see in it.
That'd be great. And my last question, and I'll stop. I'm very interested to know what other systems are doing. I know we don't operate in isolation, and you've mentioned some failures, but I know that there are others that are successful.
Yeah.
And there's already learning happening with hydrogen electric. What are they learning? Why are they successful? So I'm not sure the 5-year, that's really where I'm focusing, is I'm not sure the timeline could not be tightened, because there's a lot of learning already happening. We may just be learning it, but we could certainly send staff to other agencies to begin their training. I don't believe we are starting afresh. I think we're learning from the whole industry. And I'd be curious and would like it if staff could bring to me information about other systems. Which ones are going electric, which ones are going hydrogen, how big are those systems, what are the elements of it that they're learning from already, how long have they been on the road. I would like to know how we fit in the ecosystem of other beta versus videotape decisions.
Absolutely.
I think there's a lot to learn from others, especially the bigger agencies. They've been, playing a lot longer in the sandbox, and I think we're jumping in, but they've already had a couple years or more experimenting.
Sure.
So if you could bring that as well, that'd be great.
Absolutely. I think there's a wealth of information there. Getting you examples in a way that's not overwhelming, I think will be the challenge for us. If I might, just a couple of clarifications about the timeline, because I've already gotten some feedback that, it's a long time. We do see one way to shave a year off of it already that has not been incorporated into this table, so that's why I've said 4 to 5 years, so the 4-year would be better. A lot of it is driven by things outside of our control, so I can't submit the grant until, early next year. The feds sit on it for 10 months. They'll tell us a year from now. I can't make them hurry up. Once that's done, we're looking for a way, frankly, to streamline the procurement process. If we go through a standalone procurement like we would for normal buses, that eats up 10 months right there. We think we found a way to sidestep that, and is it just a piggybacking option?
would be a partnership option pending on
Okay.
what we went through.
So we might be able to just jump in and tag on somebody else's order or through a partnership, I don't say jump the queue, but get ahead. But then we are in we're at the mercy of the manufacturer. And at that point, parts supply, COVID shutdowns, all the things we've learned the hard way over the last 2 years, outside of our control. We're hearing that it takes 2 years. That might change. If it does, I would love to get the thing here as soon as possible. If there was a bus lot for just hydrogen buses, we could just go buy one, but they're not. They're built to order. So that's a process we can't control. Ditto with the filling station. We've got to find a way to procure that and install that. That's going to chew up some time. The actual pilot running of it, we don't want to sit on that. I think we need at least 12 months so that we see what this operates like in every season. But I don't know we need to go 18 months or 24 months. Like after a year in operation, I think we should know, frankly. So we'll cut it down as best we can, but some of these things are not within our control.
That's very helpful. And I guess one follow-up question. The presentation talks about the transition starting in 2030.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of that, does that mean that's when we apply for the next grant? That's when we put in an order that'll take 2 years for the bus? So we actually don't see the buses until 2034. I mean, what does the transition starting in 2030 actually mean?
Yeah. So anticipating that question, we tried to come up with a graphical representation of what this full deployment transition would look like. We've picked 2030 as the starting year because that's the best information we have. If it's 2029, great, there's a little bit of movement there. What you see on this graph, the gray represents our existing diesel fleet, about 103 buses. The solid green represents hydrogen replacements. So you first see 2 for the pilot project come in at the top of that graph. It goes for the duration of the pilot project. Then, and we've assumed 2030 is the date when we make a decision to phase out diesels. As I said, that's a decision downstream for us once the pilot project is completed to our satisfaction. But at some point, frankly, you are going to have to make, as the board, the decision. This has huge implications for the capital budget. It is absolutely a budgeting decision. But we've assumed at that point you make a decision to cease buying diesels and only buy hydrogen buses. The federal government requires us to keep buses around for 12 years, or else we have to pay them back for the money they put into it. So the quickest we could make that transition would be 12 years. We stop buying diesels, we only buy hydrogen. That sees that sort of geometric slope as the new buses come in and the old buses are phased out. At the same time, the long-range plan envisions the fleet growing. That's the checkered green. So as the fleet gets bigger, they would only be hydrogen from that point forward as well. So the 100% would be achieved whenever the last diesel rolls off for decommissioning, which could occur as soon as 2042. In this graph, it happens to be 2045. The graph is illustrative. It does not indicate any sort of decision or preference. That's just making a graph that tried to make sense.
Thank you.
Mike?
I think the bonding question is a real critical question that should be answered as quickly as possible. Because if we can bond, I think it has the possibility anyway of being able to shortcut some things that has to do with funding and maybe make the timeline more compact, and maybe in terms of having different options allows us to do more things too. I just don't know. My recollection is when this was looked at quite a few years ago, I think maybe it was John Metzinger who led that we cannot issue bonds except revenue bonds, and that revenue cannot include tax revenue. And if that is correct, that pretty much rules out bonding, I think. We can't dedicate any kind of a revenue stream like our fare box to pay off any bonds. Anyway, I would think it'd be a fairly easy question to answer, and we should look at this as quickly as we can.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I don't recall the limitation on revenue, but I do recall that being discussed. I'm going to ask Nina to reach out to our corporate counsel and solve that one quickly, so that we have an answer for you by November.
That'd be great. Again, I think the city, I'm sorry to interrupt, used it for the green belt. They took
Yeah.
the tax revenue
They have a lot.
and then they bonded, which enabled them to take better advantage of being able to react when properties became available.
I don't think they're limited like we are, but I could be very wrong.
Under Michigan law, just to be clear, incorporated cities have far more power
Yeah,
than, say, a township, which is only the powers the state has given it to us. Agencies like ours are treated more like townships than like incorporated cities. But we can get the lawyer to sort this out pretty quick.
I'd like to mention one other thing. You said near at the beginning of your presentation, the dilemma about whether just to look at carbon emissions that would be emitted by TheRide versus the entire stream of carbon that is required to get us there. And of course, quite a bit of the conversation then involved talking about green hydrogen, green electricity, and so forth. That's an issue I think we've got to face head on, and just first of all decide whether we're going to be looking at downstream carbon emissions. And I think we need to explicitly make that decision. I personally think we can't ignore it. And if we think that's important, and it's hard for me to imagine that it's not, I think we need some information. DTE would be the electrical source. I think DTE, I think there's data that exists currently how green is the power, what's the carbon content of it, and also they've got explicit plans that are being judged not being adequate in terms of their transition. But there is data there for DTE and some assumptions that can be made, I think a lot easier than it can be on the hydrogen side. My understanding about what's going to be going on in Michigan, and specifically in Ypsilanti Township, I've seen that it's going to be hydrogen from natural gas. And you look at the site of the group that put together the Midwest proposal. There's Exxon in there, and I think there's a number of other energy companies in there. And so it seems, it seems very likely that we're going to be starting out with dirty hydrogen. And you have to make some assumptions about how then and how long that can transition to clean hydrogen. And I would think that's going to be a long time. And so I guess I personally would like to see some kind of analysis on these two sources of energy, electrical energy, which I think there's quite a bit of data on, and then some assumptions on the hydrogen side.
Sure.
And I think that has to, my opinion, it has to be part of our consideration.
I think we can dig that up. I may lean on the city a little bit because I think they have some of this stuff sitting around already. It does raise a couple other questions that I haven't mentioned. And some of you may be aware the state legislature is active in ways they haven't been in a while. And one of the things they're considering right now is legislation to sort of compel the utilities to become cleaner faster, which raises the question of regulation. Whether or not it will happen is a separate question, and at what cost is a separate question. I think simply having the legislature say you have to be green by this date is a reality, again, back to the technology versus our expectations. If it can't get there in time, how are they going to put a round peg in a square hole? I don't know. And increased costs are a distinct possibility. And the volatility of the electrical pricing schemes is something that gives us pause. The other thing about the regulation that I haven't mentioned thus far is the potential of mandates directed at us. Right now, I mentioned that the feds have tie-barred a grant we want for the garage to this decision. But over in California, the state legislature has said all transit agencies will be zero emissions by 2035. And I can tell you some of my peers over there look stressed out. I'm not sure they exactly know how they're going to do it. It is not impossible for me to imagine the Biden administration or our state legislature giving us a mandate similar. So that does suggest, you know, even if it is premature in some ways, we should get on with getting started.
And let me just mention one other thing. You gave us the cost estimates for the pilot project for hydrogen. I have to believe you probably have looked at a comparison of what that would be if we went battery electric. And I think that would be good information for the board to be able to see.
Yes, we anticipated that, and we are updating those proposals. As I mentioned, with battery electric, they have the widest range between best case and worst case scenario. And we're seeing a lot of agencies struggle with that. If you assume that one battery bus replaces one diesel bus and there's no fleet growth, the costs look very good. If you look at the actual lived experience from other transit agencies and they can't achieve that, particularly in cold climates, you end up starting to buy maybe 2 electric buses for one diesel bus, which then can snowball very quickly into a new garage. Are those costs fair to include in here? I think they are. Otherwise, we're being somewhat Pollyanna-ish about the situation. But that doesn't make batteries look very good. And it raises a whole host of questions about why can't you do it? And so we can look into those. We already knew you would ask for them, so we're kind of updating them. The biggest question, I think, is going to be those costs. Are they in or are they out? The hidden impacts, the fueling, the electricity pricing schemes, for example, right now, we're used to buying diesel in an 18-wheeler. We know the price, it's fixed before it arrives. With electricity, it changes when you plug the bus in. It's cheaper at night than it is during the day. Makes sense? Peak hour charging. It's a good idea in general. What if we have a blackout and the fleet was not able to charge overnight and we have to charge it during the day? It's kind of hard for us who've never done this to understand the cost implications of that kind of a thing. So we'll do it. We'll bring it to you. Those are some of the challenges inherent in those cost estimates, though.
Yeah, you certainly have said all along from way back when you first started talking about this, it's about the scalability of the one versus the other option. And I think it would be worthwhile to try to bring that out in some way in an estimate at different levels of growth, including zero growth. And not just the growth, zero growth and the growth that it is in the long-range plan, but something less than that growth.
Oh, fleet growth.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, but some growth, but less than what's in the long-range plan, along with no growth, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Simi?
Yeah, I'll just say I agree with Mike that the carbon intensity of the fuel we're using, whether hydrogen or electricity, shouldn't be ignored. And I think that wasn't my intention when working on sustainability policy, was for that to be included. And those are called scope 2 emissions. What's what's being used to power the site. And I believe in the monitoring report we saw for the ends policies, you already showed us the electricity use that goes into the building. So in a way, we're already looking at scope 2 emissions. I think we should continue to do that with our buses as they transition. Matt, I asked you previously, and I think it will be helpful to the board, why it's 2 buses and not a different number. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely, great question. Long story short, that's how much space we have to park them outside. At our garage, and I'm happy to have any of you come and walk around, is space constrained. We're hemmed in on all sides by a rail track, South Industrial Road, and developed properties on either end. We would need to store either battery or hydrogen buses outside. Hydrogen buses require a very aggressive ventilation system within the barn. It's very expensive. It's part of the fueling system costs for us right now. To avoid those costs in the pilot project, we plan to store them outdoors so that we do not need a ventilation system. This has to do with the danger of any propellant, and any propellant can burn, diesel, hydrogen, batteries. If hydrogen escapes from a tank, it rises, and if the compressed gas were to ignite, it can cause an explosion. So that's the ventilation system. It's an automatic kick-on in the event. Compressed natural gas fleets also have similar safety measures in their garages. Battery buses, there's an elevated fire risk, in my opinion, that make it unwise and imprudent to store them indoors. So we're looking at where would we store them outside without incurring the extra costs of leasing property, because it would have to be a distance from our garage. It's just increased cost of sort of shuttling back and forth and maintaining them and whatnot. So we kind of looked at the back end of our lot up against the storage facility. It's something probably most of you have never seen. It was where our dumpster is. It's where our snow plows are stored during the summer. We can, we believe, move that stuff out of the way and have room for 2 40-foot buses to park out there. They're in proximity. They're in proximity to the garage. We can work on them. We can pull them out to service anytime we need it. They're in proximity to the fueling station. They're within our chained yard, so they're secured. I think that's important for either of them. And the risk of fire or ventilation issues is negated by them simply being outside. It's a way to save costs for the pilot project. But eyeballing it, 2 is probably all we can squeeze back in there. There is a lane behind the barn. It's a fire lane. The marshal will not let us park anything there. The other lane that you may see in the front is kind of a bypass lane. That's where deliveries of diesel and urea and other perishable products are made. So big 18-wheelers pull through there all the time. So that's why 2.
Thanks. And that question came up because I think, like potentially others on the board and others in the community I've spoken to, 2 over 4 or 5 years is not as ambitious as some would like to see. And I'd include myself in that. In speaking of visibility, having 2 zero emissions buses out of a fleet of over 100 compared, and it's hard not to compare to the University of Michigan's when they have their 4. I believe it's 4. And I actually saw their articulating bus operating this morning, which was great to see. For a fleet, I think about half the size, they're able to make some more significant steps. And you mentioned part of this is a visible step forward, a commitment to the agency. I think if it's decided that we make this step, and it being smaller, fewer buses than like an immediate move to transition the fleet. There are other things we can do to to also show commitment beyond this. So I'm thinking about, the light fleet transition and the discussion that's been had, and I know there's a study planned for that, but likely that won't involve a lot of maybe the tough decisions that this process is having between different propulsion systems, battery, electric, light vehicles, or relatively easy to transition to from a fleet perspective. I say relatively, beyond compared to buses. They can offer maintenance and operational savings, and I think that if we're making a smaller commitment on the bus side of things, we should potentially double down and take larger steps elsewhere. If the best course of action is to, wait some amount of time with the buses, making more immediate steps sooner. Got a couple other questions somewhat unrelated to that. You had mentioned a mixed fleet starting to be brought up. Also, I think you said transition period quite a few times, or something to that effect. A lot of things are changing in the way things are done broadly. But it seems like the plan currently is to remain pretty consistent in how we've done operations, keeping, buses the same size, the ability to operate on all our routes. I'm just wondering, you had mentioned some are going towards a mixed fleet. What's the thought of more, potentially having a mixed fleet where we have, maybe smaller battery buses on our shorter routes, and we use hydrogen where it's needed?
So this is, I think, a relatively new idea to me. I only heard it suggested a couple of weeks ago, as opposed to like an accidental circumstance where bad judgment led to a mixed fleet. What I heard was, we're doing it on purpose. That was the difference. The logic behind it, as I understand it, is exactly as you said. The shorter range, the battery buses are limited to shorter range routes. It's not the route so much as it is what we call the block. It's the bus assignment, which could include multiple routes. I don't want to bore you with the inside baseball stuff, but the shorter assignment, as opposed to keeping the diesels or hydrogens for the longer range assignments. That was suggested. My immediate question is, so you're incurring the operational penalty of having multiple propulsion systems permanently. You're just going to eat that? If you can afford to do that, and that's what the priorities of your agency are, good luck to you, sir. My experience in transportation has been the budget will tighten up. Tough times will come. And then you start looking for ways to reduce overhead and operating costs. And redundant systems that maybe looked like a good idea in good times start to become anchors around your balance sheet. So I hear the idea. It sounds to me like one of the complicated workarounds where someone's trying to work a round peg into a square hole. I don't, airlines don't have propellers. Well, I guess they do have prop planes, but they all use jet fuel of one sort or another, right? People don't, they standardize, and this gets back into fleet management. Sorry for inside baseball. We try to standardize all of the equipment as much as we can. We don't want the mechanic to have to be trained to do two different types of drive systems, simply because it's more expensive and it's more likely to lead to some sort of error that affects the customer. It's better to have one sort of thing that you can wrench on. And if you're going to change once, do it thoughtfully, bring them up, to speed as you go along. I think the idea of intentionally having a mixed fleet, I don't know that that's going to work long term, because the economics behind fleet managements and economies of scale and interoperability are going to become a problem. So just to give you an example, every day, George's crew is working to put a driver in a bus and get that bus out the door. Sometimes it comes a little closer to not happening than we like to admit, but we don't have to worry about whether the next bus in line is ready to go, because they're all interchangeable. They all can work on any route. So we just grab the first one. To have to pause at that moment to say, do we have a bus that can do this assignment? Is it charged enough? Is it February? Like, that's a whole level of complication and thinking that we simply don't have right now. It's just not a factor. We don't consider it. Can we learn to do that? Absolutely. It will cost us. I have no doubt in my mind that that will incur delay, additional cost. It'll show up in the salary lines. We have to hire after FTEs or something. It will show up, but it'll show up in this sort of hidden way of inefficiency as the economies of scale from the interoperability begin to degrade, if that makes sense. So I do think mixed fleets may be tried. They're already being tried. I'm not sure they'll still be tried 10 years from now. Looks like George maybe has something to offer.
Yeah, on that point, there's a lot of great questions being asked, and one of the opportunities that we've had over the last year is to visit other authorities, but also to reach out to other larger authorities that have given us presentations and taught us lessons learned. One of the things that has come to bear that we've noticed, especially with DDOT, going with the electric buses, they're very excited. In the beginning, they thought they could meet service, but then they realized the winter came, and they realized the goal of zero emissions was no longer meetable because they had to install auxiliary heaters using diesel to heat the buses. I think like when we ask that question, what does University of Michigan know that we don't know? They're now about to go through that process. What is it that we don't know that we don't know? That's where the unknown equation comes into play. The other things, like even SEPTA, huge authority on the East Coast, that's where I'm from. They just realized now that out of their 14 bus barns, they're going to have to spend an unrealized budget of $50 million to modify the 14 bus barns. These are the lessons that you learn as you go through it. There are wild cards that we don't know until we go through it. So just staying on that point, that I just wanted to bring that to bear, and just to let everybody know that we really are trying to do our due diligence to find out what makes sense.
Did you have any further questions, Simi?
Yeah, thank you both for speaking to that. Yeah, I think I'm just thinking about in the spirit of transition periods and things changing. You know, we recognize that we can't necessarily, you know, do things and operate the ways we have historically. And you know, I'm thinking about, you know, partnerships. The University of Michigan public schools were mentioned. You know, numerous fleets locally transitioning, and the ability to, you know, maybe it doesn't all necessarily have to happen at the site on South Industrial. You know, spreading those things out and thinking about, you know, the possibility of a mixed fleet. And it's also confused me in the past when, you know, we want to avoid two technologies in the fleet, but noting that that's necessarily going to happen as we transition from diesel to something else. There will be at least two technologies, so maybe we don't want three, but
Yes.
but that's confused me a bit.
The mechanics will spin it up, yes.
Moving on to a separate item, is the fueling infrastructure that's planned for the pilot, would that be sufficient for how much, if we go then to full deployment? There's another large line item for facilities infrastructure later on in 2030. Is what we put in with the pilot sufficient to transition beyond 2 buses?
As we're conceptualizing this, one of the things we want to do is anything we buy through the pilot project is a permanent thing and is there forever and becomes part of the full deployment. So the fueling station that we envision buying here would be something that we want to keep to probably become one of 3 fueling stations. I'd love to have you guys come by in an evening and watch our service crew clean and fuel the buses. It's quite an orchestrated dance with the vehicles that are there. I believe it takes about 7 minutes to fuel a diesel, Troy?
Blow your mind. Tony's got it down to 4 minutes, 45 seconds.
Amazing. What's it with hydrogen, we're thinking?
So depending on your bar ratio, and I don't know if you've gotten that deep with hydrogen, low case scenario, 350 bar, you're looking at approximately 15 to 20 minutes with compressed.
So if we need to fuel 80% of the fleet every night, which is not a bad way to do it, it's roughly 80 buses at 15 minutes a pop. That's 20 hours. Obviously, you don't have 20 hours overnight, so one fueling station isn't going to work. We're spitballing. We're going to need 3. They might come off the same tank, but have different compressor technology. But we can scale that up, and this one that we buy here would be something that we would keep and use in the future. So we want to avoid throwaway costs, I guess, is one way to say that. And if I might respond just to a couple of kind of the questions about partnerships, and off-site fueling was another example. We did look at off-site fueling. We considered that, and yeah, it's viable. You just have to pay someone to drive the bus to go do that and then back. Again, it's a fleet management technique. You try to keep the fuel pump close to where the buses sleep overnight so that you minimize that cost. Because, I'll be honest with you, that cost does nothing for customers. It's just the overhead cost of fueling the fleet. Some places, the only places I've seen doing that is where they have to do it, and they all desperately want to move their fueling station closer to their garage, if not in their garage, like we enjoyed today. We have looked at some opportunities for that. The school board is right on the other side of the tracks. If they were to do something, could we drive the bus over there? Yeah, but I'll need to add probably FTEs for the care and feeding of the propulsion system. If we're all okay with that, we can do it. But it's effectively overhead that is not being spent on customers. We just need to acknowledge that. With partnerships, there are possibilities. School buses, fundamentally different, although I suppose we could share a fueling station, possibly, if that's something they want to do. With the university, it's possible. We work with them really well on a bunch of stuff, operations to operations, and Troy's over there all the time. If we happen to buy the same sort of bus in the future, yeah, a joint procurement is possible. But I want to be clear about what that gets us. It doesn't save time. It's still a procurement. Our fleets combined, 150 buses, somewhere in that neighborhood. That's small potatoes. New York City loses more buses every day than we have in Ann Arbor. We are not a big fish in the manufacturing world. And so 150 bus order for replacements, okay, that's nice. They're not going to drop everything they're doing for us. So it's not going to reduce the implementation timeline remarkably, nor will it reduce the unit cost. Buses are not sold, it's not Costco, where you get a bulk discount. The sticker price stays the same. Unless you happen to be Chicago or New York, and maybe you can use your market power.
But are there opportunities that make our grant applications more attractive because we are doing partnerships?
Absolutely. I think, if we continue down the hydrogen path, working with the American Center for Mobility, I think is a very real possibility. I mean, they're 11 miles from our garage. I think that's a huge opportunity. I know informally there are other transit agencies in this area that are now actively considering hydrogen. We're not alone there. So there may be some possibility for cost sharing or something on the back end there. we're happy to explore any of those possibilities if they're really viable, if there's a benefit to them.
If I could remind the board to please raise your hand if you have a question, if it's not your speaking time. I would appreciate that. Thank you very much. I'd like to keep it on track. Simi, did you have anything else? I'm good. Okay. Any other questions? Yes, Kyra?
Focusing a little bit more on the mechanics of the grant application, what do you assess the sort of level of competitiveness here?
It's tough. A lot of people rush in the door for these grants. This kind of gets to a culmination of things. Obviously, the money is enticing. I think we can be very competitive. We can bring 20% match. The capital reserve is nice. Some places may struggle to do that. We can do that. The fact that this hydrogen hub is going in right next door, that obviously is going to play to our benefit. All of the research that we have done will help us write, I think, an amazing application. Frankly, some of these things have been done on the back of a napkin. I spoke with another transit agency in this state, and I'm sorry to beat up on battery buses, but the same would apply to hydrogen. In this case, they bought a battery bus out of the same grant program without factoring in the infrastructure and rewiring their building. And now they can't charge the bus. So in terms of why are we doing as much due diligence as we can, we don't want a mistake like that to impede the direction of it. So I think we could be competitive. We would have all the basis of these conversations. We can bring money to the table. We have assets in DC through an advocacy firm that could help us write, I think, a really good grant proposal. We can learn from the other successful grant applications. In the conference that several of us were in, we had dinner at one night with 2 other agencies who've won these grants, and we grilled them. How did you win? What did you need to do? There's sort of the core basis of it, and then there's, I call the sprinkles on top, the sort of political things you need to do in a grant application to make it appealing. I think we can do well in those areas. It's no guarantee, however. Many agencies have had to try once or twice before they are successful. I do want to note part of the logic behind the pilot project, as opposed to a more aggressive full deployment right out of the gate, is making it attractive based on the money. The feds have a finite amount of money in every grant program, and they want to spread it around the whole country. They want as many ribbon cuttings as they can get. If your project is really expensive, maybe they're only going to get 1 ribbon cutting instead of 2. So there is a certain mathematical logic that I believe they use to start looking at how can these grants help us achieve the political things we want to achieve as well. So I think keeping it relatively low makes it easier for us to get a yes on the first tryout. The higher the dollar amount goes, I do imagine it becomes more difficult. Not necessarily impossible, but more difficult.
Given that the technology in this space is so dynamic, is there any precedent for if the hydrogen becomes obsolete during the course of the pilot program, then what happens to the pilot program?
That is an issue we're all still grappling with in the industry. We heard quite a bit at the conference about people with earlier generations of both technologies kind of struggling with, well, doesn't work. What are we supposed to do with it? And the FTA is in a bit of a pickle because they're supposed to get their money's worth out of it, which is 12 years. But the agency's basically, well, we'll park it on the back lot for the next decade and, run the depreciation down if you want. I don't believe our industry is entirely grappled with that. I'm looking at my peers. I remember this conversation, but I don't know if you guys were there for that. So I don't know exactly how that's going to be grappled with. And dynamic is a good word. There's a lot of these things coming up that haven't been solved for yet.
I guess, I don't see any harm in the board, given that we have more information and more discussion at the next few board meetings, moving forward with giving you authorization for the grant writing process. I think that this is not a question, but just the board, the things that I'm thinking of that the board needs to consider. I mean, I'm risk averse. It wasn't that long ago that we were climbing out of a hole. We just got comfortable with our capital reserve. I'm very wary of making a large financial commitment if the net benefit is actually not that impactful as far as reducing emissions if we're still using dirty hydrogen. I think that's a concern that the board needs to take seriously, that this is not just like marketing or lip service. I understand that there are some unknowns that make it, like, we don't want to not take any action from our sustainability perspective, but I am wary of making commitments that don't actually have a real effect on our sustainability efforts. And so in that sense, I'm comfortable with the extended timeline when the risk of the financial risks to the organization are pretty significant, especially given the fuel, like looking at the presentation, the fuel costs are also a big concern to me as a huge unknown. And we dealt with that a few years ago with the diesel buses too. So that, you know, all of this is difficult to grapple with, but I think the board is gonna have to be clear on our priorities and having a little bit more faith that, I will need to have a little bit more faith that this is actually going to have a net positive impact. And I think we also have to keep in mind the ridership considerations. You know, you didn't really phrase it as an either or, and I don't think that we should either, but we do have to consider if this project does actually help increase ridership, which was our predominant goal in our ends and still is. So again, I'm in support of moving forward with the grant application and then working out these sort of details as we go along. So not a question, just more of a comment and things that I think we'll need to continue discussing. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyra. Jesse, did you want to speak now?
Thank you. So, this might be a little bit unrelated, but as a lifelong resident of the area, I remember when TheRide used to have a mixed fleet with different sized buses. I used to ride one of the smaller buses. And I've always wanted to know when and why that changed, and I actually now have a reason to ask you, because I feel like that could be a good case study in the, like, what went into the past decision to not have a mixed fleet. Like, was it a financial consideration? I think that might be some helpful information. If that's something you have now, that's great.
I do not. I believe that decision was finalized just before I arrived. I do remember a 30-foot Orion bus still in our fleet. Orion has been out of business for a few years by this point, so it was neat to see one still in service. It was replaced with a 40-foot bus. We have occasionally used the cutaway shuttle bus type things. There is some value in using a smaller bus on a very low ridership route. It can quickly sort of deteriorate or undermine the economics of it. If you, again, and how it affects the fleet management, does it require different parts? Yes. Different training? Yes. It can be done at a small scale without huge problems, but as it grows, it becomes a bigger issue. The interchangeability also is a challenge. So, you know, I flew recently and I went in to check in, and most of the gates were not being used. Most of the check-in gates. I'd say maybe a third of them actively had staff. But when Thanksgiving gets here, those gates are going to be completely full. Freeway at 2 a.m. you don't need all those lanes, but in rush hour you will. We build infrastructure, particularly transportation infrastructure, for the peak load. The electrical system, I think, is built for the same way. Water and sewer system is built on the same principle. You built it for the heaviest thing you have to handle safely in those cases. Transit system is built to be able to handle rush hour. The 40-foot bus is a really good tool for that. Having a fleet of completely interchangeable buses where any one of them can be swapped out for rush hour is really convenient and drives your sort of overhead costs down. If one of your buses and you put it in rush hour and it's too small, the crowding is to us a failure. It might be a momentary inconvenience, but customers let you know pretty quick that's a failure. So that tends, after a certain size, to push those smaller buses out of the fleet. There are other reasons different fleets use different size buses, Arctics versus 40-footers. I could go into it. In our case, I think some of the lower demand routes, I remember there was one in Pittsfield that was being experimented. You know, there's industrial parks on State Street South near the airport. They were trying it, just didn't get any takers. So there's a variety of reasons for it. Yes, you can do it. I'm advising that we be very cautious about doing it, particularly with propulsion systems and the size of the bus for that matter. It's not really a factor here. They're all 40-foot, but on both factors, there are costs associated with it.
All right, I'm getting a little more technical, I guess. I'd like to know more about the storage concerns with hydrogen. I've heard that hydrogen, being such a small molecule, really likes to escape from things. And so I'm wondering, like, how many days worth of hydrogen could be stored on site, and how long can we store hydrogen?
I'm going to call a friend here and tap Troy to help me with this. But he has advised me similarly that we consider the hydrogen molecule like the Hamburglar. He's always trying to escape. It is a very small molecule. It requires special pipes, transport chain. You know, it's different. It's different. You're absolutely right. So, Troy, you want to walk us through your thinking on that?
Absolutely. So, Jesse, one of the things I think you're referring to is hydrogen embrittlement. It's the escape through different types of alloys and metals and those sort of things. So the question is, this one question could be a 2-day conversation. But I'm going to try to boil it down real quick for you. So one, it depends on the type of storage that we pick. That is straight honesty. So if we pick let's say a 500 kilogram storage tank, which is a fairly low, fairly small sort of storage tank, along with a cooling system, a pump, and the associated electrical equipment, that we could run for about 5 to 7 days on about 500 kilograms. They also sell, Plug Power also sells a larger kind of all-in-one kit. It's stored on a semi-trailer that'll get you upwards of 1,500 kilograms, and that would run us for 10 to 12 days. So the other option and questions also talk about delivery and logistics, and when you talk about those two, you have to take what type of hydrogen am I going to get, not dirty or clean, but are you getting liquid or gaseous? They become very expensive when you talk about those things, and I can break those down in a sidebar conversation with you. Liquid does look to be our best option, and then there's a conversion process that goes with that. So when you're talking about how long can we store it, in liquid format, we can store it virtually as long as the tanks are good. Tanks are generally certified for 6 years. We would not sit on hydrogen liquid that long, though. It just wouldn't happen. But and the other thing is that if we see growth, we can also very easily modulate that system by just adding small tanks or small modular sets to those. As we're an electrical infrastructure, you have to add an entire existing line, a brand new catenary system. There's a lot of things that went into those sort of decisions. So if you want any more, we can sidebar afterwards.
Okay, so and the driving thought behind that question, and a couple of these actually, is thinking about the power out, the extended power outage, and I'm anticipating, having not seen substantial infrastructure and systemic change in power delivery, that could happen again. One of the nice things about diesel is we can store it for a while. We can buy a lot of it and keep it around, and we kept our buses running. Is that something that we can? I basically want to make sure that we can store hydrogen, that amount of hydrogen for that long.
We can store it, and I think that the other piece of this information kind of relates back to your original thought process about what if we did have a power outage, is that under our current generation system and the one that we're planning to have implemented within the next year or two, it'll be able to support that backup system. So the larger trailerized system that I was talking about basically runs off 223 phase, 400 volts, very comparable to what we would be able to just install for some welding equipment back in the garage. So very easy transition and electrical process for us.
Okay.
If I might, it does raise another set of factors. Our existing garage is full, but the location is great. We're never gonna get a better location for our service in Ann Arbor. I do expect in the next few years, we're gonna start talking about a satellite garage for fleet growth, not related to propulsion system, but for service growth. We're gonna need to start talking. That one can be designed from day one with the propulsion systems in mind, and we could even maybe future-proof it so it could handle a change. But the existing facility, I don't see us ever leaving it. But it is space constrained, so where we put any of this stuff is still sort of a question. And when we look at the tanks, like there's a limited amount of room in our garage. So the space available may force us into, the liquid system, may force us into an upright tank, which is not normal, but you can do it. It just stands really tall. So there are a lot of things that we'll have to figure out as we go through it. But even with the battery electric systems, and this is something from the video presentation to be clear, either way, we're gonna have a lot of very expensive modifications to that building. It's gonna be inherent to both technologies. The technology, the wiring in that building is from 1984. It will not handle this. We're gonna be doing a lot of renovations if it's batteries and a lot of renovations if it's hydrogen. So we just have those they almost cancel each other out.
On the battery electric side of that, is there a feasibility of, in the event of a long-term power outage, being able to charge the fleet off of generators, like saying, okay, power's going to be out for 4 to 7 days, we're going to run a diesel generator to charge the buses?
Yeah. How big a generator do you want?
Well, that's what I'm asking. I
It's
don't know.
huge.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I think we did look into this. I don't know if we sized it specifically, but Troy, I remember it's enormous.
Yeah, it was absolutely huge. So our current size and constraints we've had, we weren't able to put enough generators in line to be able to charge it. And then the other expenses that were kind of not talked about on there were transformers and other switching equipment that would be required to handle that load of electricity. It's just, there's a ton of space that we would need to be able to modify.
This graph, you've seen it before, but I think it's helpful to get the impact. A fleet half our size consumes more electricity than a skyscraper. Like the amount of wattage that batteries of this size pull is amazingly large. So what we have as a backup generator today hardly works for what we have today. We are replacing it, but that's barely enough to run the shop. Charging buses, it's a whole other ballgame.
I think I'm not going to restate everything Kyra said, but because you basically just voiced a lot of my concerns, I think really the service is what's paramount, and I want to make sure that whatever we're doing is going to be resilient to the struggles that we are aware of, and also resilient against things that we maybe haven't anticipated. So that's the kind of the driving force behind those questions. You said that you had visited Champaign-Urbana, and they made a big deal about having their own electrolyzer powered off solar. Can you tell us anything about that?
So I'm hesitant to mention it because I don't want to overcommit, but we sort of anticipated the interest in green hydrogen. Champaign-Urbana is using their own solar panels to run an electrolysis system to generate their own hydrogen. It's done on site, in situ, if you will. You can call it like small batch production if you want. It's an intriguing idea. I'm very curious about it. I asked Troy to dig up some numbers for me about how much solar panels would we need. Technically it's possible. Engineeringly it's possible. The question is it economical? And one of the things that in my mind is not known yet for hydrogen is the future a centralized energy plant, like with coal or natural gas that then is distributed? Or is the future in situ generation in small batches? Some of you are aware of a real estate idea that I hope to brief the rest of you on at some point. Is it possible for us to have our own solar field? Maybe. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. It's not related to this project directly, but it's possible. What I don't know is, will it work? Can we scale it up enough to build our own hydrogen? Some of it, yes. All of it, I don't know.
So, I mean, their claim, Champaign-Urbana's initial claims that they will be producing all of their own hydrogen. Are they producing all of their own hydrogen? Is that an industry secret?
So currently, Champaign-Urbana, they're not operating very many hydrogen buses. So they do produce enough hydrogen to fuel their several buses that they have at the moment. Did you want me to get into the solar farm picture of this at all?
Let's see if they have more questions
Okay.
about it, but it's, I think their rollout right now is more of a demonstration project scale, not a industrial scale attempt.
Correct. What I will say is that in a sidebar, I can share about some of the constraints that they have and some of the issues that they're facing.
Okay. I think, like, for me, if it's not green hydrogen, then it's kind of a non-starter. Grays, no one in our community is gonna be in favor of the gray hydrogen, and the only people I've seen, that I've read, supporting blue hydrogen are the people who have industry interests. So those aren't what I consider to be credible sources. I've not seen any credible example of carbon capture, so I'm going to pretty much dismiss that out of hand unless I see some credible evidence to it. So the feasibility of hydrogen is going to be, for me, be entirely dependent on the feasibility of green hydrogen. And I like the idea that we could produce it on our own. Again, that's why I'm asking about storage. If we're going to be powering it on solar, can we overproduce hydrogen in the warmer months so that we have enough saved up for the winter? That's not something that seems as possible to do with straight electrical storage. Our batteries don't have the same energy density, so that's kind of like the direction that's the appeal of the hydrogen to me.
If I might interject for
Yeah,
just a
go
moment.
for it.
Your description there was very evocative. I suddenly saw us all as squirrels, hoarding nuts for the winter. I'm hearing one answer to one question already, and that's the importance of end-to-end, wheels-to-wells green source. So I think that's an important thing. I do want to make sure we all understand that electricity is not green today. And despite a lot of aspirations in that space, I can't tell you when it will become 100% green. We can say what people want to happen in both of these spaces, right? This is the uncertainty problem that we hit, is that we don't know with either one, when will they actually become? Laws are one thing, regulations are another thing, actuality is a different thing entirely. So it's kind of an open question on both of them.
I've been debating whether or not to ask this last question. I think you'll either refute the premise of the question or you could choose to answer it. A lot of this sounds to me like a proposal to give us a chance to work out operational issues while we wait for the technology in either case to progress. Like, I don't know, there's an element to to kind of hope. You've said that neither technology is where it needs to be. So there's definitely going to be a wait and see. You've also said that the hydrogen fuel cells are operationally more similar to the diesel buses in terms of the fueling. We're not going to have to change as much operationally. They fuel in a more comparable time frame. It's double, but it's not hours. It's still minutes instead of hours. So if there are greater operational challenges with the battery electric buses, why not go with battery electric buses for the pilot to try and work out those more complicated operational issues? I'll just leave it at that. Why not use the pilot to work out the more difficult questions?
A couple of things, and we did consider, it's a slide I took out of both presentations, the alternatives, the other scenarios we've kicked around, and that's one of them. Why not have a pilot project with both? Part of the answer is, well, U of M's doing half of it for us, so we'll do the other half. The other thing is that, and I just want to be really clear about this with you guys. I've kind of danced around it. I feel like I need to be more clear. The battery bus technology that exists right now is a dead end. it doesn't scale. The problems with it are significant. One of which is I can get 2 of them and I can store them outside. After that, the fire risk, and I didn't even talk about fire, I would have a great deal of concern with the decision to store them indoors. The fire marshal basically said, we can stand on the curb and watch your fleet burn, but we can't stop it. So right there, we hit a wall at 2 buses. If we decide to ignore that, or a better battery is invented that doesn't burn, then we start to hit all those other challenges, the range, the scalability of the charging infrastructure, the heating issues, if you look at this like a race, and a foot race, and there are hurdles that have to be overcome, both of them have to clear a question of how much does the energy cost. Both of them have that challenge. Both of them have to clear the hurdle of how clean is the energy. They both have those things in common, but to different degrees. Beyond that, hydrogen, that's kind of it for hydrogen. But batteries have a number of other significant challenges. So in terms of why not buy 2, I'll be honest, frankly, on desk work alone and the experience from our other transit agency sisters, we can see that dead end there. There's really no need to buy an electric bus to test it, because we're not testing the thing that matters, which is that dead end, which is driven by economic concepts and technological breakthroughs that haven't happened yet. So there's not a lot of value in hands-on. As I said in the presentation, if there's a breakthrough in battery technology, yeah, that could be a game changer. A lot of my concerns with fleet management and customer service can be resolved. I don't know if and when that breakthrough is going to occur, but the hydrogen doesn't have those problems. So with U of M running a test in our same environment, I think they're going to see those issues. They're probably going to be the same issues we're hearing about from every other bus agency, because as awesome as we are, we're not unique in this respect. The hands-on stuff that I'm most interested in learning is for a system that I think we can actually fully deploy, that can get to 200 vehicles, not just the fixed route bus fleet, but the paratransit fleet, and maybe the support vehicles too. I'd love to roll them into this thing. Because I can see a narrow path for their viability. The only things blocking it are the cost of clean hydrogen. But the technology works. That's a market issue that I think can be resolved in the next few years. Yes, there is an element of a pilot project of trying to use a little time to wait to see if the market's mature. How is this hydrogen hub going to work? Is it green or is it blue? I don't know yet. What's the markup for green hydrogen? We don't know yet. So I don't see a lot of value in testing a battery bus because the issues are known and hands-on experience won't change the issues. We've had several battery buses through, the mechanics have kind of looked at it. There would be some learning value, I suppose, in learning to service them, but that's not the thing that's going to be the deal killer for battery buses. It's these bigger macroeconomic problems, if that makes sense. I don't know if I'm expressing that very well.
No, that was a great answer to the question. Thank you. And that's my last one.
Thank you, everyone. I'd like to have the opportunity now to ask a couple of questions and get some clarification, please. The first thing that's been brought up by some of my colleagues is the University of Michigan fleet. Our fleet, we have 103 buses. We're looking at 2 in our propulsion study. University of Michigan is looking at 4. How many do they have in their fleet?
I think it's about 50.
Oh, they have 50. Okay, thank you for that clarification. I appreciate that. One of the things that I've heard, we've talked about hydrogen being gray, and a colleague mentioned that that's not acceptable. When I think about electricity, I know electricity isn't necessarily as green as we like to think about it, because we have to think about it, how is it developed and how is it, all of that. But one of the issues we have not been discussing that gives me great concern is the batteries themselves. The batteries have to be mined. Are those being mined green? The batteries have to be then manufactured. The components have to be manufactured. Is that being done green? And finally, when the batteries die, they have to be disposed of in Mother Earth. how is that going to affect things if everybody goes electric and has it? I believe I saw, how many batteries per 40-foot bus? Is it 4 that were on this, on the top of it?
For the battery electric
For the
bus?
battery electric bus, is it 4?
So that was just kind of a representation.
Oh.
There actually can be very many more, and then there's also packs versus inline stacks. So that is again, a very, I hate to be the guy that's like, there are so many options out there, but there's definitely so many options out there.
I think my point is, as I'm thinking about this, is that it's important to think about what is green, not just on what our tailpipe emissions are and what we're trying to achieve, but we have to think about all of the processes that we're receiving. So to me, electric is just as dirty as hydrogen when you start to factor in how the batteries and things are taken care of. To me, that is a risk factor that I would like to have more information on. The other thing you touched on is a concern of mine is fires. So if one of our current fleet goes on fire, it's my understanding whatever the mitigation system is would pretty much take care of it, and the rest of the fleet would be relatively unscathed unless something is very close. It's my understanding when you have an electrical fire, they're all sort of housed in the same thing. So if one goes, they all go and they all burn at a higher rate of speed. Would we be able to recover our fleet, or how would we respond to our customers? How would we prepare for something like that? You've already indicated that the fire marshal has said we would not be able to handle that. We would sit there and watch your fleet burn. The other thing I'd like to think about is the very real possibility of power outages, and we talked about what it would take to have generators and things like that to mitigate that. Are we prepared to tell our customers next if we go to an all-electric fleet, I'm sorry, our buses died and we are out of power for 8 days, so for 8 days you don't get service. I'm thinking of the long term, once we fully transform the fleet. These are all things that I do believe that we need to do our due diligence on and think about. And then my final thing is I was remembering that when we received our Nova buses, we wanted to put them on routes that had the highest visibility. We were very proud of our Nova buses and happy with the branding and the things that they would provide for our customers. And through that, I'm remembering that we were told, no, you cannot just put a bus solely on one route. That bus has to be able to go on all routes. It's an equity issue. It's a Title VI issue. I believe it's also a funding issue, how we get our funding from the federal government in that. So if we were to get an electric fleet, but we would only want to put them on our shortest routes, I don't believe we can legally do that. So those are all my thoughts. Sorry, I just shoved them at you, but it's so late and I'm just tired.
Yeah, I hear you. Perhaps some of those we can follow up with next month. We can go through
That's
them.
what I was thinking.
But I can offer a couple of clarifications. Yes, through Title VI as a condition of the federal money, we have to spread the wealth. The service must be done equitably, and that means in a non-discriminatory fashion. So if we have a new bus, it has to be shared. Every neighborhood has to have some benefits. So that's what you're remembering. We're forced to rotate it. The FTA actually makes us document where the bus has been. I would assume that goes for any new bus, regardless of the propulsion system. So I hadn't actually considered how that might challenge the range issue on electric buses. That's a factor I hadn't thought of before. We can look into that. The fire issue bears a note. I want to clarify, first of all, anything can burn. I want to be right up front with this. Every propellant or energy source can burn. We have had diesel buses catch fire in our garage. It was many years ago at this point. We have a sprinkler system that's built to handle that kind of a fire. We still really want the fire department there, get it out as fast as we can. But diesel doesn't burn like gasoline. Hydrogen, again, can burn, but what the fire marshal told us is he actually kind of prefers it because it's just one big pop and then it goes straight up and you're done. So it doesn't burn, it explodes. So take that for what it's worth. That's why we fuel hydrogen buses outside. Battery buses, there's something about the lithium ion batteries. And if you Google lithium-ion battery fire, you'll find examples. It burns differently than diesel or wood. They've given it a euphemistic name, runaway thermal event, which I thought was some sort of, just euphemism for fire until I saw the videos. It's not a regular fire. It's like a blowtorch coming out of the battery. It happens, as far as they can tell, because there's some sort of defect between the chemicals in the battery, as I'm understanding this, they mix in a way they were not intended to, and that causes spontaneous combustion. It happens frequently when the vehicle is being charged. When it happens, I want to be clear, it doesn't happen all the time, but if it happens, that's one way it happens. The other time is frankly just with no warning at all. If you Google it, you will find, unfortunately, several examples of scooters and e-bikes exhibiting this behavior. There have been, unfortunately, some fatalities in New York City where people had stored these things inside their walk-up apartments, and while they're asleep, they just ignite. And it's not a smolder, it's a blowtorch coming out of the battery. It requires an enormous amount of water to stop one of these battery fires. It is not normal. It almost burns in spite of the water. And that was the fire chief speaking to us very energetically, that's something that's very difficult to control. And videos online you can see will bear that out. The risk for us is in how we store our buses. And I don't have a great picture for you. Or maybe I do. They're stored very tightly packed together. There you go. That's Edmonton, but that gives you the idea. That bus is probably less than a foot in front of the bus behind it. It's 10 buses deep, and it can be 10 rows over. It's hard to walk between them when they're packed like this. This can be done safely with diesel, with the existing sprinkler systems that bus garages have. They're built for that. If the bus in the middle, 2 rows back, ignites, I don't know how that's going to go. It might stay contained to that one bus, or it might spread. What does it do to the building? I am a little concerned if something like this occurred indoors. The fire chief basically told us that he would be very nervous about allowing his staff into the building where you've got a whole lot of water and high voltage batteries. Are they going to walk through puddles of water? Are they, how's this going to work? Again, transitionary period. We just don't have a lot of experience with that technology to know how to deal with that thing. But there is a low risk of a catastrophic event of a significant fleet fire that takes out a good chunk of the fleet and possibly the building. That would be catastrophic in terms of being able to serve our customers. I don't want to oversell that. Again, diesel can burn, hydrogen can burn. I don't want to oversell it, but it is a uniquely high risk when we're dealing with lithium-ion batteries. And I don't know anybody who's solved it yet. And we have actually heard, I can't remember which agency it was, they actually realized, maybe it was George, maybe it was at the conference, we heard they had to park the buses further apart to deal with this issue, and that drove the garage problem, that they realized, oh, if we park them like diesels, we're fine, but we can't. So we need another garage. And that's a significant expense.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open it back up to the board for a second round if any other things have come to mind. Seeing none, Mr. Carpenter, thank you very much, and Troy and Dina as well for your input.
So if I might just wrap up here, thank you for this conversation. This was a very good start. What I think I heard, and we're going to go back and watch the tape and try to catch every single one of these requests. My job was to give you a recommendation. I think I'm hearing you say, but what about the other options? Give us some more information on the batteries, give us more information on the costs. What about some of the other alternatives that are being discussed? I'm also hearing you say, yeah, upstream emissions matter to you. You don't want to look at just the tailpipe. Fair, thank you. and maybe there's just so many little things, and I apologize for how comprehensive this is, but those are some of my big takeaways from this, and we will work to bring that information back to you. In addition, we're going to try to refine our cost estimates, and we're going to have, one of the things, I'm actually surprised, honestly, you didn't ask me more questions about that graph. Dina and I were expecting more. The implications of this graph, we're going to keep working on it because how much we pay for which project matters. So we're going to work on that, the cost estimates, and all of the questions that you've asked. We will endeavor to bring back as much information as we can next month, and we'll continue the conversation. I'm glad we allowed ourselves this much time. Okay, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Matt, and everyone who contributed. There were a lot of amazing questions this evening. You've all certainly given me things to think about. Matt, I know you just got done talking, but it's time for the CEO report.
Just a few more hours. I've used that joke
No.
before. I want to start by thanking Rosa and all the staff who helped with the construction report. I appreciate the board's acceptance of that report. I want to thank the staff who contributed to it because the success of the monitoring task force in how we sort of restructured this, it means that every time we go through this, we're kind of rewriting them. Rosa's doing, I think, a great job in that respect, so thank you. And a lot of people are helping with the data in there as well. Okay, so good news on the Ypsilanti Transit Center. The planning contract is signed. We're off to the races. Please watch for more details there. We're excited to get that going. We're also launching public engagement very soon about the detailed planning for the millage services. So this is, again, a federally required process, but we are trying to nail down some of the details. We know the broad projects, overnight service in Ypsi, express service, later evening, more frequent weekend, that doesn't change. But there's a lot of details we need to sort out, and we are required by both you and law to do that with public involvement, so we will be doing that, and we're looking forward to that work. We did have a good initial presentation to City Council. I thank Kathleen and Rich for being there with me. It was an interesting meeting, not because of anything we said, but just because of the times. I want to congratulate Kilo Coward for winning first place in our bus rodeo. I'm glad the bus rodeo is back. I want to thank George for that initiative and shepherding that back. That's great for staff engagement. A lot of exciting things there. A lot going on with legislation, both in federal and state worlds these days. There's some bills. The Democratic legislature is kicking out some interesting things. So we're monitoring those, kind of hit or miss in terms of how far they'll go. Similarly on local, the Transportation Commission last night, there's a resolution pertaining to bus lanes. So we're, of course, very eager in that and supporting that as well. I can't think of anything else to add, but I'm happy to answer any questions that the board may have.
Thank you. Does anyone from the board have any questions for Mr. Carpenter? Seeing, Mike, I'm sorry, Mike, thank you. I was so busy looking.
Yeah, Matt, is there anything new on looking at another site for board meetings?
Yes, we look forward to bringing some information to Governance Committee, but Deb and I toured a very promising site in Ypsilanti, just a block, two blocks from the Ypsilanti Transit Center. I think we have an option. It seems to meet all the needs we have for IT and accessibility and other things. So we look forward to bringing that forward to you. It's the Arts Center. I'll just, go ahead and say it. Right? It's just, it's right at the end of Pearl Street. It's an amazing older building, but we had a look. It looks good.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mike. Any other questions? Seeing none, we're going to go to closing items. Action item recap. That again is Matt and Deborah.
So there's a lot coming out of zero emissions. I'm not going to try to list it because I think I need to watch the video myself to catch it all, but I'm sure Deb will help as we go through and make an itemized list. monitoring task force may be seeking to abolish itself, it sounds like, so the governance committee will be perhaps hearing about that. I want to thank you all for your approval of the Title VI program in your consent packet. That concludes that work. We are done now for the time. We will have to take it up again, I think, in 6 years? Forrest would tell me. But it's a regular thing and part of just keeping on top. So thank you for that. That actually paves the way for doing all of the millage service planning. So it was important to get that done. I'm sure Forrest is relieved. I think that's it. Coming back next month to hear more about zero emissions, I think is the key thing. We got a deadline. We need to get you information.
Sounds good. Then that leads to topics for next meeting. We'll be talking about the treatment of the traveling public, which is policy 2.1, compensation and benefits, policy 2.3, and then we will continue our zero emission bus discussion at that time. Finally, we head on to public comment. Deb, is there anyone online that would like to make a comment since there is no one in the gallery?
I don't see any hands raised.
Okay, then that closes public comment and we are on to adjournment. Before we adjourn, I'd like to thank everyone for your participation and your thoughtfulness during this meeting. I thought it was a very successful meeting with regards to the propulsion. Would anyone like to make a motion to adjourn? That would be Kyra, seconded by Jesse. All in favor, please raise your hand. And that passed unanimously. Good night, everyone.